That's better. Oh, back to meeting. Okay, now join audio and share screen.
Yes. Are you on the Indigenous Peoples meeting?
Yes, but it is recording.
Yes, it should be. And you can hit at the bottom, pause recording, not.
Okay, great. We are recording and we are about to go live in however many, 3, 2, 1. Let's see how long this will take to, maybe like 30 seconds. It might take a few seconds.
Well, we are now streaming live on Facebook. I've just received the notification. Good afternoon and good morning to those west of here. OCO in Cherokee language. On behalf of Paver Opera, we welcome you to our panel today called Indigenous Peoples Day, a celebration of recognition and identity. Our panelists are Indigenous music and opera professionals, legal scholars, and visual artists and activists. And we want to welcome you all today and also welcome to those watching. Today we hope to provide an important, informative hour or so that will educate and inspire and broaden your perspectives on the experiences and insights of Indigenous peoples. Not only here in the Americas, but across the globe. We'll be talking from an international perspective in a little while as well. So this is a historic moment in our collective lives. So today I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal Lenape land and the ancestors of Eastern Pennsylvania and the Philadelphia region from where we are live streaming, and give thanks for this opportunity today. So right now I'd like to offer and turn it over to Sage, the founder and the artistic director of Paver Opera, Sage DiPalma, to welcome you and introduce our panelists.
Okay, hello everyone, and my name is Sage DiPalma, and we started Paver Opera to connect and bridge opera and community. And formally, the Paver Opera Company is dedicated to bringing opera and related music to wider audiences by stimulating community engagement through performance, opportunity, service, and education, making it a more accessible art form. We are excited to have this panel to honor Indigenous Peoples Day. I just want to first make a point. As we discuss Indigenous Peoples Day on a holiday that has been celebrated as Columbus Day since 1971, as an Italian who loves and embraces my father's Italian heritage, so much that I've studied opera and founded an organization solely on my love for this art form of opera. I remember one thing, which is you must stay relevant, acknowledge the voice and the perspectives of others, not ourselves, that the positive experience of some can simultaneously and quite well be the opposite and a negative experience for others. We will delve more into that a little bit later. And today, staying relevant also means having the ability to transform our old or outdated information on our perspectives. So here we are moving forward together and making sure that we acknowledge and celebrate and honor the Indigenous peoples of this country. So the next, specifically the Americas. And the next thing we would like to say is we're going to talk a little bit about the people coming onto our panel. I guess we will start out with, let's see. We are going to start with
we can start in an inverse alphabetical order with Thaddeus Strassberger. Do you want to? Go ahead, Sage.
Wonderful. We'll start with Thaddeus Strassberger. He's of the Cherokee Nation. He is an international opera director and scenic designer. Next, we have Marique Moss. She is of the
Hidatsa.
Of the Hidatsa Nation, and she is an activist and works with youth as well as is working on her legal studies. Next, we have Kirsten C. Kunkle of the Muscogee Creek and of the Muscogee Creek Nation. She's a soprano and the artistic director and founder of Wilmington Concert Opera. And next we have Timothy Long of the Muscogee Creek and Choctaw Nation, conductor and musical director of opera at the Eastman School of Music. Then we have Taiawagi Helton. He is a Cherokee native and a professor of law at University of Oklahoma. Then we have DeAnna Bear, of Lenape Nation, and she's a grant coordinator for Running Strong Indigenous Youth Organization, as well as a visual artist and jewelry maker. And next we have Gabriel Ayala, and he is of the Yaqui Nation, and he is a classical and crossover guitarist, as well as a visual and material artist. So thank you all so much for being here. It is an honor to have you all here.
Yes, it is. It's an honor to have us here. And I wanted to just start by talking about communities. And I know that this morning, Tim Long had a conversation with Sage that was pretty informative. And Tim, do you want to start us out just talking about how you got into music? You have a very long and beautiful resume that is collaborative, and just you've risen to a really wonderful level in your field. So would you mind starting us off?
Sure, I can start, and it's good to see everybody. And I've even done an opera with Thaddeus Strassberger many years ago, and I hope we can do them again in the future. And I hope opera happens in the future too. So I grew up in southeastern Oklahoma, a town called Holdenville, which is in the very southern part of the Creek Nation. And a lot of people ask me how I got into opera, and I like to say it's all because I am Indigenous, that I am in opera, because my mother grew up in an Indian boarding school called Goodland down near Hugo, way down in Choctaw country. And when she got into high school, she caught tuberculosis and was sent to an Indian hospital in Talahina, where she was quarantined for a total of 5 years. And I wouldn't be in music without her experience, because she started listening, everybody there listened to country and Western music. That's Reba McEntire country, FYI. Reba's great, but everybody was listening to country and Western music, and my mother got sick of the twang. So she found a classical radio station, and when my sister and I were born, the only thing that she played was Beethoven. So we heard Beethoven symphonies and piano concertos. I grew up listening to Germans play Beethoven, so Wilhelm Kempf and Alfred Brendel in particular. And I got a toy piano at age 3. And I played it so much that my mother found this 15-year-old high school girl who wanted to start teaching piano. And she became my teacher, and I was her first student. And she didn't know what to do with me because she'd never taught. So she started me on theory at age 5. I had a theory coloring book before I could read. And my mother, who didn't know anything about music, read me the question, and I would color in the answer in my theory coloring book. And I was probably the only kid in Oklahoma to have a theory and coloring book, much less Indigenous kid with a theory coloring book. And I also, the first place I actually heard a live piano was in this Creek church where my grandfather was a minister. It's called Salt Creek Indian Methodist Church in Yeager, Oklahoma. So the lady who was a relative, Hetty Long, and became my babysitter, was the church pianist. So I would sit there and I would just watch her fingers going into the keyboard, and I used to play it on every surface I could find. So yeah, all of my music is a direct extension of my mother's own experience in the boarding school and the hospital.
That's a really fascinating story, and such an interesting, you know, an unusual path to having, you know, come to where you are at this day. And so just to inform our audiences, can you just tell us what you're doing right now in your life? Because some of the audience might not be aware of what you are, who you are, and what you do.
Well, right now I'm working on losing COVID weight, and I teach at the Eastman School of Music, so we are in the middle of projects. You know, we have our own revised projects here because of COVID. So the first thing that we're doing is something called Our Voices, which is a composer collaboration with 6 highly esteemed composers in the vocal world. We have Ricky Eden Gordon, Erilyn Wallen, Missy Mazzoli, Lori Laitman. Who am I missing? Oh, Ben Moore, who's wonderful in New York. And we also have Anthony Davis, who just won the Pulitzer Prize this year for the Central Park Five. So we have all of these composers zooming in with our students. They help collect the programs for us. They're meeting with our students to talk about the songs. They're helping us in coming up with the concepts of the programs. And then we will, we're in the process of recording the pianos in a large hall. And then the students will do their own design for it, and we will film them with a green screen in our large recital hall. This will all be pieced together, and then when we release it in a festival format, the composers' interviews will become a part of our project as well. So I'm currently working on that. Then I have a recording next month, thank goodness, because I miss playing. And we're doing with a wonderful baritone named Brian Mulligan. We've done a CD before. And we're doing music of Mason Bates, Greg Spears, and Missy Mazzoli. And I also have my own internet show starting on October 22nd, which is also going to be made into a podcast, and it's called Unequal Temperament. And it's going to be dealing with race and music. And my very first guest is the brilliant First Nations filmmaker and librettist, Marique Moss. I've worked with her on an opera for 3 years. She's just a genius, and I can't wait to talk to her about all of it.
Well, that's
our world situations.
Yeah, and that's really kind of, you know, where we're steering in this conversation too as well. I want to bring in DeAnna on this, and then Marique to talk about kind of like the community context in which you're working around Indigenous issues. And DeAnna works for an Indigenous youth organization called Running Strong, and it really does thrive on a community model. And so can you talk about that a little bit, DeAnna? And then Marique, from your perspective as a Black Indigenous woman of color, just as, you know, Tim was sort of going into this idea of you know, sort of the racial context, just sort of where you're intersecting in your life as you teach others about Indigenous culture. So DeAnna, could you go first, please?
Sure. So Running Strong has been around for, gosh, maybe 36 years now, and it was founded by Olympic gold medalist Billy Mills. And he's still a heavy hand in the organization and will continue being that way. But our primary focus is helping Native youth. And we really appreciate that the community comes together to make sure that we are an active resource for Native youth. So we have programs where Native youth, they have an organization in mind that they want to start, or an idea as far as revitalizing their language, or wanting to have different powwows and Sundance ceremonies. And that's something, especially during this time, that's really difficult to make possible. And when you're living in a situation where your community is dismantled because of colonization or effects of colonization, they're kind of stuck standing there going, well, who do I turn to for help? Who do I go to relearn what's an inherent desire, and how do I get this funded? So we act as a primary resource in the community, specifically for Native youth, helping them to revitalize the parts of their life that they didn't know that they were there, but they feel that they were there.
And that's wonderful, because in addition, and Marique, if you want to talk more about this, is the importance of bringing and reaching back out. We have learning new skills, and then we also have reaching back out to youth. And Marique, how do you implement that in your organization?
So, hi everyone. I just want to acknowledge that I am in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and I'm speaking to you from traditional and ancestral Dakota and Ojibwe lands. I work for a plethora of organizations over here. So there's not just one or two specific ones. The main thing that I like to focus on that I've been learning myself is Indigenous identity. And I guess you can say with the recent social uprising of like the murder of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, especially with Minneapolis being like the epicenter, and another edition of the American Indian movement, literally starting here in Minneapolis as well. Solidarity and education are very important for both groups to collide and come together. And I'm realizing that a lot of groups, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, aren't very well versed in like the solidarity movements, and they're still colonized mindsets. So mine is to get out there and indigenize and colonize and educate, say these are your relatives, and that's kind of the work that I'm trying to get at and put together. And it's all solidarity. And with the, again, with the social uprising, it's been phenomenal over here. The OG AIM guys have come together over here with the BLM guys. It's beautiful over here. So that's kind of the work that I'm doing over here.
Right, and you're also studying Indigenous law.
Yes. Yes, I am. I graduate in December with a Master's of Legal Studies in Indigenous Peoples Law from OU. And
Yeah.
like, yes, like Tim, I also have a podcasty sort of situation going on. It's called Mixed Up on the Mississippi, for obvious reasons. I bring in my friends who are Black, queer, and me from my Indigenous perspective. And we talk about being stuck literally in the middle of the country with all of our perspectives. And we kind of just rant and rail. So just talk through our different unique lenses. So
yes, that sounds great. That sounds really great. You know, it's true that, you know, this time of our lives, you know, with COVID going on, we have a lot of challenges facing us. And we know that Indigenous populations, especially, and as well as Black and Brown communities, are disproportionately impacted at this time. Not only is there sort of a cultural shift going on in 2020, but you know, this global pandemic, which is a critical global climate crisis of you know, the greatest proportions we've ever seen. And I just want to take this second to just acknowledge the ones who have crossed over at this time, and their families and their communities, and offer, you know, anyone who is watching our, you know, our support, our love, and our, you know, just our support, and that you're, you know, getting through this. And this panel is an effort to inspire and educate about things that, you know, people are doing at this time to function and to, you know, to be resilient, because we've all had to learn how to do that. Thaddeus, you've worked in some of the, you know, getting back to, you know, kind of actually sort of integrating these ideas of, you know, the COVID situation and the community situation and international aspect of all this. Can you talk about, you know, what is your perspective on all of this? You've worked in some of the best opera houses all around the world. What are you thinking on this?
Well, I think it sort of mirrors what's happening in society in general. You know, sort of cultural differences between each country have really come into place. For example, how much the arts are valued in a sense by the government. I mean, I live in the UK, but most of my work is in China and in Russia and in, well, this season also Austria and Germany quite a bit. And the amount of support that the arts receives in the good times in general is much better overall. And I think we're seeing that really starkly in contrast with what's happening now. For example, I mean, Germany basically is paying everybody as an artist. You know, if you had a contract, or, you know, if you're a freelancer or not a freelancer, you're continuing to sort of get paid, you know, based on the work that you had going out. And they know that it's vital to not just the economy. I think Americans talk a lot about the economy, and the economy like that's some important thing. I mean, the economy is just there to support people being happy and, you know, interacting with each other. And so I think it's kind of backwards. We should have culture going on, and then we've got some good culture, then maybe the economy will come around. Another thing that I'm really passionate about in what allows voices to be heard, and I think this really ties in a lot with the sort of indigenous voices and how much space there is in the world. And a lot of it comes down to the healthcare system that is available to people around the world. So many people, the arts in America especially is very, very precarious for many people, that there's not a guaranteed income, that you're sort of having to bounce around and, you know, sort of have your hand out to lots of different institutions, and, you know, you get a little bit here and a little bit there and you try to put it together. That's all well and good if you come from a certain background with, say, a certain education or a certain sort of entry into it, or a certain sort of level of financial support that you started out with your family. And there's a lot of people in underrepresented communities, including the Indigenous one, that don't necessarily have that. So when you're coming out of high school and looking at sort of college situation, like there's a lot of support maybe for colleges and education, but then what's the other side of that? Getting a job and having to sort of pay for everything. And it really comes down to, I think a lot of us are really passionate about the work that we do, and we make music, we make poetry, we make events, and we're willing to do that for almost nothing, right? Because like we're so passionate about it, we just love words and images and music. But the problem is healthcare is something that we can't live without. You can't sort of eat a can of beans and get through a meal. If you get cancer, if you have diabetes, if you have a child, there's lots of things that require healthcare that aren't because you're a weak person or a stupid person. It just happens because we're human, and like the natural state is to be born and then get sick, and then we need to get healed, and then we're ever slowly deteriorating till we die. So we all need healthcare, you know, and the culture that we create in the meantime and connecting is really what's making it great. And one thing that I think that we can really, that I would like to see more of in the Native American population in America, is to really talk about this model of the Indian healthcare system, because we can all complain about the little details about this, and, you know, that maybe we're not happy with certain elements of it, but it is a basis for a nationalized healthcare system that works, that allows access to everyone. And I think it's something, but interestingly, it's not even open to everyone who identifies as Indigenous, because there's lots of rules and regulations around it, and not everybody has access to this. But it's like a tiny little model for how we can be better humans, just being able to have access to healthcare. And then the next step in that is that gives everybody sort of a basis for more freedom, because to have this sort of safety net underneath it. And I think that a lot of people are addressing these things in little ways with different scholarships and bursaries and support systems. But I think we really need to take into account the specter of healthcare problems and having a family that comes into that. And I think that that's something that sort of identifying a problem in the world that's not just, oh, we're not getting enough space, you know, and that somebody else is sort of keeping us out of that space. But I think that there's actual real life and death situations that can be addressed. And so to come back to your question, Jacqline, that's it's basically in Europe, we don't have this problem. A lot more people are allowed to have this platform because you're already sort of a fully functioning member of society, not dependent on what you came from and your background and how you get there. So we're sort of muddling through it, and I can't say there's like a really good way, but when we're in a healthcare crisis, the idea that if something catastrophic should happen, that, you know, help is a phone call away, not my whole life savings call away.
Exactly, and that is really addresses the governance structure of, you know, as you see the variant governance structures within the different nations in around the world. And
I'd like to interject. So you discussed a little bit about access to healthcare. Obviously, and now especially in COVID, we're all being faced with this, especially performing artists. But going back to access to healthcare also is connected with access to your rights as a human being, and your sovereignty as a human, your autonomy and your sovereignty as a person. And we wanted to kind of direct a little bit going towards Taiawagi about sovereignty of nations and the work that you're doing, and how Indigenous people can be recognized and work with the United States government and within their own tribal councils and work and create something cohesive. How would you talk about that?
Still muted there. Thank you so much for having me on this panel. I'm a law professor, and so I often end up not being able to talk about art and culture so much as law and power, or politics and power. So I actually would like to start very briefly with a great statement for Indigenous Peoples Day, because I think it's a really important repudiation of the principle that might makes right. That because of the way the nation state system developed, Indigenous peoples were treated largely as domestic populations that were inside a nation rather than being recognized as self-governing peoples. And when explaining why their 14-volume historical collection was not called History, but instead The Story of Civilization, Will Durant said, civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing and stealing, shouting, and doing the things that historians usually record. While on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is what happens on the banks, but historians are pessimists because they ignore the banks of the river, or they ignore the banks for the river. And I think Indigenous Peoples Day is a really great statement, first about survival, that for centuries of efforts to eradicate the physical, sociocultural, and political status of Indigenous peoples, those people have survived. They have remained enduring populations and with an enduring land base. And I think that's really important to remember. And then also that the international community is finally repudiating some of that. And so, you know, I also want to emphasize, I'm not a member of the Cherokee Nation, and sovereignty and political status is one of the things that distinguishes tribal peoples from other demographic groups in the United States. And Sage, you asked about sovereignty, and I really want to emphasize that because the nation state system that developed at the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, which was that bloody conflict where Protestant and Catholic claims of universal power led to pressure to fight on behalf of those ideas. It finally ends with the nation state system that becomes the international community and then international law. And that is the idea of territorial sovereignty in which the sovereign is the absolute authority. And we have this general idea of non-intervention in domestic affairs. Well, when the United States, or before the United States, all of the predecessor nations to the United States, and then also the United States, recognized the sovereignty, that is the self-governing status of the indigenous peoples they encountered in North America. They recognized them as self-governing sovereigns by entering into treaties with them. And there are still 371 ratified treaties between the United States and tribal nations. They are still part of US law. But in 1831, the United States declared that tribes were something other than foreign nations, and they certainly were not domestic states. Instead, they were called domestic dependent nations. And even though the United States claimed or continued to enter into treaties with Indian tribes, recognizing their sovereignty, it declared that the US would view it as an act of war if any other European power tried to enter into a treaty relationship with an Indian tribe. In a way, they declared the Monroe Doctrine before the 1820 declaration of the Monroe Doctrine. And I said 1831, that's because that's a Supreme Court case, but the US was already treating tribes as somehow different than other nation states. And as the US military and economic military and transportation technology and power grew, their recognition of tribal power and sovereignty started to diminish. And you see this on the international stage as well. By the time Australia is contacted, now European transportation and military technology is much greater. So they give no recognition early on of Aboriginal rights because they have the power to not recognize that status. And so what we saw is the nation state system develops increasingly where every nation that has an indigenous population starts claiming that that population is just one of its many groups and not self-governing separately. And I think it's really worth noting that membership in the international community, a primary requirement is recognition as a member by other members of the international community. But if you look at, say, the Montevideo Convention's definition of a state, it requires that as a self-governing people, you have a defined territory, a permanent population, a government, and then fourth, an ability to enter into relations with other nations. In other words, recognition by others. So if you look at indigenous groups, they've got all of the requirements of being self-governing peoples according to law, except recognition by nation states. And I think that Indigenous Peoples Day is a really important moment to acknowledge that the nation state system developed so as to treat indigenous peoples as if they were somehow invisible, that they were populations of a bunch of individuals rather than being self-governing groups or self-governing peoples. And in the US, the US law still recognizes tribes as not just a group, but as a sovereign entity. But I think it's really valuable that Indigenous Peoples Day is recognizing that the nation state system systematically and consistently disregarded the rights of indigenous peoples. And although they are not yet at the stage where they're ready to say, let's add another few thousand nation states to the international community, they are increasingly recognizing that one of the fundamental flaws of the international legal system is its disregard for indigenous rights. And I think Indigenous Peoples Day, combined with things like the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is an important acknowledgement that even if we're not ready to simply say all tribes are nation states, we are recognizing that the current structure of international power does not sufficiently recognize the rights and needs of indigenous peoples, and those rights and needs are legitimate. And so I think it's really valuable that as we talk about the sociocultural elements of tribal status or biological descent and ethnicity, we still think about political status, because it's the political the exercise of political and physical power that has been used to dissolve social bonds, undermine culture, and even contribute to the decimation of indigenous populations. And so I think as we think about Indigenous Peoples Day, it's a day of cultural and human survival, but also a day acknowledging the recognition that certainly we should not be celebrating Columbus, but we should also be memorializing Indigenous peoples who have come and gone in the past, as well as celebrating the continued survival of Indigenous peoples today.
Wonderful answer. Thank you so much. And that's a perfect transition into more specifically Gabriel, and then Kirsten, if you want to also talk about this, is the importance of us. Both of you have done things with your art, and you can talk a little bit about that. Both of you have done things with your art to personally take responsibility in using your art or your for instance, Kirsten, when you were taking your PhD, to personally preserve and make a rebirth of your specific Indigenous culture. So you're preserving your culture by being a proactive participant in that. Can you guys both talk about that? Gabriel first.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. Leosim Chinyago. My name is Gabriel Ayala. I'm from the Bosco Yaqui tribe in beautiful Tucson, Arizona. And I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. Really thankful just to be a voice of our generation as a musician, archivist, and just as a native man of prayer. There's so much I think that needs to be said with Indigenous Peoples Day. First of all, I think it's a great step forward, but it's ultimately just a small recognition of who we are as Indigenous people, and we need to push even further. We can't settle as, oh, I got the mayor to change it to Indigenous Peoples Day. It doesn't do anything for our children. It doesn't do anything for our elders. It doesn't do anything for our traditional ceremonial way of life. So although I applaud everybody's efforts in getting it done, I still think that it's just a small little pebble that we're throwing into the pond where we need to be throwing boulders at this point, because the time is now. As a musician, I am classically trained, a master's degree from the University of Arizona. So bear down, Wildcats. I have to say that legally, and it's an important thing for us as Indigenous people. Here we all are in mainstream in our fields, and we're really trying to break these stereotypes of who we are as Indigenous people. I think that is more important than anything else. Is it showing people who we are, that it always comes to me back to our children, that we can show them that they're bound for greatness. And just because we're born into our culture, it doesn't limit ourselves into what we are able to do. I still sing traditional songs. I still practice our traditional religion, our ceremonial way of life. This is just an extension of us giving ourselves a platform for the betterment of our people. To live in servitude to all of our relatives, all Indian country, not just our own communities. And as an artist, as a visual artist, I've kind of tagged myself as an archivist, of bringing in stories and things that need to be addressed at the time, whether it be Standing Rock, whether it be a wall being put up just in my own almost backyard here in southern Arizona, which a wall is going to go through the traditional lands of the Thana Autumn Nation. And so I've used that visualization and poked fun at it in a form called ledger art, and used it to bring to light of important issues that people just aren't addressing. It's just it's a real travesty of what's going on in our country. As Indigenous people, we've always known that we're the original caretakers of this land, but unfortunately no one has ever given us the opportunity. They've only tried to stop us. We have this thing called COVID-19 now. It's just another, BC for me. Non-natives always have BC. They have before Christ. They have before Columbus, before Kevin Costner. Here as Indigenous, we have before commodities, before casinos, and now we got before COVID. But the thing is, we as Indigenous people, we've been facing this for hundreds of years. We've faced this influx of people that came into this country with negative and awful intentions. And for me, those are the things that we need to address first before we can continue to do anything else, is make people aware that we are First Nations, period. And we are all related as Indigenous people. And I hear, I can't remember your name, I'm sorry, from Minneapolis, talking about these different groups finally uniting and getting together, from the OG Aimsters. I know all these cats and stuff. And it's a beautiful thing that finally, after 500 years, we as Indigenous people are uniting. We do finally understand that, you know, divided we stand, you know, and we can't live that way. We have to stand united so that we can continue this beautiful way of life, this beautiful culture, and everything that we do. So me as an artist, as a musician, those are the things that I aspire to do in my life, is creating and using my platform for mainly the children, to give them hope, to give them that opportunity to better themselves, and of course to honor our elders and all that's going on. I mean, that we don't even, I mean, there's so much that needs to be addressed. I mean, we could all, I'm sure, talk for hours and hours and hours, because we're so passionate. That's why we're here this morning, because we believe in this way. We believe that sharing even just a couple of words might have an impact even on just one person. And if it does, then that's positive, because we were that one person that it had an impact on when somebody shared their words. But again, we need to address the travesty, the real travesty of the murdered and missing Indigenous women all over Indian country. And nobody's talking about that. You know, we finally have an act signed in government. By the way, I don't trust government. I don't trust politics. I don't even trust tribal politics. I trust the Creator. I trust our way of life, and I trust prayer. But I use that, again, even through my art and through my music, to talk about the things that people are afraid to talk about, to tell people that I will stand with them regardless of what has to happen, that I will be there. So again, I thank you for the opportunity, for being here. And if there's more questions that need to be addressed directly towards me, I welcome that. So thank you again, Sage, and thank you again, Jackie, and everybody else on the panel. Chokot Desia.
All right. Guy, that was great to hear from you. It's been, you know, it's really easy to get caught up in you know, the sort of drama of it all. It's overwhelming, the survival that we have to go through, the coping mechanisms that we have to employ in order to preserve our own sanity at this point, and in the context of structures that are imposing upon us. But
so Kirsten, also, would Kirsten like to talk about how you are also preserving your culture and bringing it into the present?
Sure, be happy to. Thanks, first of all, for including me in this panel. I'm so delighted to be here and to meet all of you officially via Zoom. Once upon a time, I met Gabriel in DC at the Smithsonian. I'm sure he doesn't remember, but I remember him. And every time people find out I'm Muscogee, they ask me if I know Timothy. And now I can say I do a little bit. So I am delighted to be speaking with all of you today. So I was raised in Northwest Ohio, and I was very much raised in white culture. So I've always had this dichotomy of looking a little different from everybody around me. And I always jokingly say I'm ethnically ambiguous until people realize what I am. And then they say, oh, okay, I see it. So I've always looked Native American, but I did not grow up in that culture like some of you did. But I've always embraced it as a very important part of who I am. And when I did my doctorate at University of Michigan, I wanted a capstone recital that was important to me, important to who I was as a person, and deeper than just researching a composer that everyone knew. So what I chose to do, I had a long commute one day, and I decided that I had this moment, this light bulb moment, where I decided I wanted to bring the poetry of my great-great-great uncle, Alex Posey, to art song. Now, Alex Posey for a very long time was known as the Creek Bard. nowadays that's probably been usurped by Joey Harjo, which is great. But at the time, you know, he was the person I always knew I was related to that was a name, that was famous, that had really great art behind him. And so I took it upon myself to commission a number of these works, mostly with student composers, and premiere them. And I learned so much more about my own culture at that time and delved deeply into, you know, Alex Posey's deep conflict with being in white society, but also in Native society, and trying to bridge the gap, especially during the Dawes Commission. And I thought, well, that's really interesting because that's part of who I am as well. You know, I'm very much Native American, but I'm also white. So I had that conflict or opportunity, I guess, to bring that to a different audience. And so I was able to premiere those works, and I got some publicity through Muscogee Nation News, and I got them acquired at a couple of different museums, including the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian, which is where I first learned about Gabriel. I first learned about Timothy as well. And they were kind enough to put me on their classical Native American artists and musicians list. And from there, I've been able to publish on those. I've been able to perform those a bit more. And I get people coming to me from time to time saying, we want Indigenous music. What's out there? And the fact of the matter is that there needs to be a lot more. What I did was just a starting point of what I would like to do. It's also a starting point of what I think could be done. And I think that there are classical Native composers and musicians out there that people just don't know about. I think to bridge the gap into where I would like to see future things happening, there needs to be a lot more proclamation of what we're doing ourselves. There needs to be a lot more collaboration. And I think we need to be proud and stand up and say, this is what I'm doing. This is what can be done. This is what's out there. So I think it's very important to honor and maintain our cultural heritage. With what I did, it was a step to take the poetry of an ancestor who happened to be famous, who happened to have a good output, who happened to be important in Muscogee heritage and tradition and culture. And that was one step. And what I'd love to see more of is that we honor that Native heritage, but we also realize that we have the honor and the duty to take it to the next level, so that we are having the music of the powwows, and we are having Native flutes, and we are having those things, but we are also creating our own music. And by having our own music and our own voices now, we are able to create what is current Native music. Mm-hmm. The music that Timothy is working on now, the music Gabriel's working on now, that is the music of the 21st century in Native American times. And I think that is one of the big steps that we have, that we can take to maintaining and nurturing cultural heritage, so that it's not just the stereotypes. Mm-hmm. It's beyond that. It's embracing what we have in our history, but also taking it to another level, so that if I incorporate other aspects of my life, it becomes Native culture because I am Native, because that's part of what I'm drawing from. And so I think that that is important to me because, as Gabriel said, I have a child and I want her to have that be part of her heritage and her culture as well, so that I can bring everything I know and make that part of her life and make her proud of who she is. And also, I think it's important to, if we're going to have minority voices heard, it needs to be heard and encouraged in education early on, so that people hear these voices and hear these names and hear these sounds that they might not hear in a traditional background or a traditional elementary school or traditional outreach experience, so that they see these people and have that representation early so that it's normal. Mm-hmm. And by having it become normalized, it becomes part of their culture too. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
That's wonderful. And Thaddeus is raising his hand, and then next I want to direct a question. Go ahead.
Well, that's something interesting. Like, as there's been, even just in the past year, like we've been talking about, a lot more focus on this. I've had some conversations where people have insinuated that I'm not indigenous enough because they didn't know that I was a member of the Cherokee Nation beforehand. And I'm like, I don't do my own Wikipedia page, but that's been on there for like 10 years. Somebody else knew that. And it's something that I always include in my biography when I'm working around the world, because it is part of my identity. And I think that it can be a talking point and a touchstone for other people to sort of ask a question, and it opens up a conversation. And I think as artists, all we want is a conversation. But I think that's also really interesting, exactly what Kirsten was just saying, is, oh, that doesn't sound like what I thought Cherokee music or art would sound like. And so therefore, I don't think it's Cherokee enough. And then it's like, well, hang on, but if I'm a Cherokee person and this is what I'm doing, then by definition, I'm a lot of things. I'm a very complicated person. And that what you're going to get is hopefully a complicated, you know, sort of understanding of my world. And that's why we have platforms for people to do things. And just because it doesn't sound Black enough, or doesn't sound gay enough, or doesn't sound, you know, Muscogee enough, like, well, you know, it is enough, because they're all nuanced, and everything isn't, you know, literally black and white, that there's lots of things in between. And I think for me, one thing that's been helpful recently is just people are more curious and to ask those questions. And I think that's been a very positive thing. But I find in general that people in further away places are much more interested in Russia. Like, I can talk a lot about Cherokee culture and background, and, you know, my childhood experiences and things, and, you know, how did I end up in Russia? And then, you know, all of a sudden they can talk about indigenous people in Siberia, and, like, you know, something about that. And I learned something about there. And then you also start, like you were saying before, that indigenous people have this kind of like connection through, and you start to see iconographies that are similar, writings that even look sort of similar, you know, costume and way of interacting with the world and rhythms and things. You start to find these things. And so I think keeping it in the conversation and sort of busting down stereotypes, and not letting people say it's not enough this or that, is helpful.
Yeah, I just want to follow up with that. You know, culture is the sort of like, culture is the common context here, whether you're Muscogee, whether you are, you know, Lenape, whatever you are, Yaqui, whatever culture is the common. And I think that this sort of foundation that Gabe was talking about, which is like helping the culture, uplifting the culture, you know, looking forward with the context of the children and the generations to come. This is sort of the foundational groundwork that everyone has in common here who is indigenous. And it's something that's particular. And I think that it kind of leans off what Kirsten was saying, that you're bringing your identity, and also what Marique is saying too, you're bringing your identity into whoever you are, whatever your work is. And it's very important to stay centered in that. You know, as Ty was talking about recognition and talking about just sort of like the lack of it within so many nation states and the international community. I think that the whole construct of civilization and civilizing Indian people or indigenous people sort of like comes out of that perspective of wanting to, seeing something that's different, particularly different, and particularly what I think of as completely special. And
I have a wonderful question, and Tim and I, we were talking about two things. So it's important to work with other cultures that are not just indigenous, because you are, for instance, in the classical opera world, it's a very, and Thaddeus as well, westernized, if you are in a specifically Western area, how are you, number one, adapting to that culture and keeping your own, and then adapting to what is, and then because you're putting yourself, or as you all are putting yourselves in that context of certain Western societies, how do you then bring yourself and use representation to make sure that not as many people are in the example where they are the only ones who are Indigenous? And how can you make sure that they don't feel like they are trapped in their Indigenous body, but that many other people can see them standing in who they are, but also working with the Western culture, if that makes sense?
Is that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yes, okay, if I can speak a little clearer, how are you adapting to working with your two different cultures, and then standing in the culture that you are, and then making sure that you represent your culture so that the youth, and I guess this will add to everybody else afterwards, so that you can be an example for the youth eventually as well?
Well, it's a very complicated question. Just referencing what somebody said earlier about how do you, I can't remember what the exact statement was about growing up native in a white world. And I think one way that I sort of did that was kind of a denial in a certain way. I grew up around a lot of Creek people, and we were integrated with white people as well. So I didn't really know, this sounds silly, but I knew my family spoke Creek. We went to a Creek church. I was around Creek people all the time, but I didn't know that I was Indian, because Indians were those people I saw on TV and Westerns and on the Lone Ranger. And those did not connect in my mind, so much so that when we were little kids and we went to our very first powwow, I remember my sister and I started crying because we thought the Indians were going to get us. And that kind of speaks to having role models in the world for ourselves, because I never saw Native role models. I always like to joke that my one Native role model was that guest superhero on the Super Friends, Apache Chief. He would come on maybe every other month, and he would yell out some fake Apache words and become a giant in his loincloth. And that, honestly, that's all I ever saw. So in order to survive, you do go into a kind of denial because you want to excel in somebody else's world. So you imagine that you are one of them. And it wasn't until I left Oklahoma that I started noticing I was never around people who looked like me. Mm-hmm. And then classical music is quite difficult. It takes a lot of focus. It takes a lot of kind of selfish dedication, hours and hours and hours of practice every day for years, that you tend to focus on yourself. And it wasn't until I got older that I started talking more, and I realized I was the first and only Native American that people in my world knew. And that's still the case. I'm usually it. And I'm an unusual person. Like Thad said, I'm also a complex person, have a lot of different unusual qualities. And I think in my mind, I become an exception to people. And the problem with that is once I'm an exception, then they don't see us as human beings, because they see me as an exception to this group. I call it the Edward S. Curtis effect, because he became so popular that people still look for that. That is America's Indian in a way, the Edward S. Curtis model, but that was never true. And I think we're still held up to that standard. People don't often care to see what I call a 21st century Indian, because we're not allowed to evolve like other cultures. Every other culture is allowed to be in 2020 doing all these varied careers and varied things and having varied personalities. And they often expect us to have one traditional job, one traditional personality, one traditional viewpoint. And for me, after growing up in a sort of a denial in order to sort of focus, I feel like it's my job simply to show up as my native self, to be seen for other people, because in my world, I can be seen for a lot of people. And that doesn't mean I have to bring any part of my private life into it, but simply to show up and say that I'm Muscogee and Choctaw. And I do talk about it quite a bit now. And I often will conduct in a ribbon shirt as well. Because I feel like the best thing that I can do is show up in a place that I'm not expected to be in order to say we are still here. So I conducted a couple of times in Prague at the theater where Mozart conducted the world premiere of Don Giovanni. And you walk into that pit and there's a plaque on the floor where Mozart stood. And when I made my debut there, I got to stand on that plaque in my ribbon shirt representing Native Americans in Europe. And I felt very, very proud to do that. I know that's not going to change a lot of things, but it's going to change people around me. It's going to make them notice when others are Native. It's going to make them care a little bit more because I'm showing that it matters to me.
Wonderful, thank you. And there's so many hands here. There's so many hands because I guess you sparked some type of inspiration here. Quickly, before we're going to return to that, I want to direct a specific question to Ty about some of the concrete actions that you are doing to further. We have the arts and we have access to education, but there's some of the legal things that that people like yourself are doing to, in a concrete way, help the Indigenous people. And can you talk about that and how that will, doing the action now will further help the youth? And then we'll get into that a little bit after.
Well, there are so many things that are taking place in the context of federal Indian law, whether it's language preservation or criminal justice. But I think the primary focus lately has been on questions of jurisdiction. Certainly in Oklahoma lately, was a recent Supreme Court decision that said that the Muscogee Creek Nation Reservation was never disestablished by Congress, and the reasoning that leads us to conclude that the original boundaries of the boundaries of the Muscogee Nation remain intact. That will apply to the other 5 tribes in the eastern part of Oklahoma in the original Indian Territory. And jurisdiction is fundamentally a question about sovereign power and authority over people and property. And this recent Supreme Court decision on which so many of us worked was a tremendous reaffirmation that Native people have the right of self-determination, and that that if that is going to be taken away, and the Supreme Court has been quite clear that it won't tell Congress or the executive not to be a conquistador. But what it says is that if you're going to act like a conqueror, you need to be very explicit that that's what you're doing. And since Congress had never explicitly taken away that portion of the sovereign territory of the Muscogee Nation, it remains intact. And so, so much of our focus has been on preserving jurisdiction and authority so that tribes can then exercise their sovereign rights, and that whether that is helping them with the development of an environmental law code so that they can preserve their own resources, or whether it has been to try to reacquire land that has been lost, or to preserve water rights that have been taken away. So much of my own focus has been on building national capacity within tribes, and then also preserving tribes' authority over their own people and their own resources. And that is an area where the pressures are just constant and varied. The pressures to whittle away at tribal self-determination are fairly constant. And so much of our work is focused on trying to educate as many people as possible through an expanded online program in our Master of Legal Studies program that Marique talked about before we got started, or the traditional Juris Doctorate program to educate lawyers. There's so much work to be done in Indian country that I've sort of had to accept that my legacy will not so much be the direct work that I do, but the work that gets done indirectly through the students that I wind up having the honor to affect. And so my hope is that there will be sort of generations of law students and legally educated folks who go back and take tribal leadership positions and continue to sort of stake out different areas of self-governance, so that opens up space so that people can write poetry and music without constantly feeling like the bottom part of Maslow's hierarchy is being taken away from them.
Wow, thank you. Okay, and let's kind of, thank you so much. We just wanted to make sure that we had that said, and then we just want to, before, in case you had to hop off, and before there were some hands, who would like to respond to that? I think Marika, did you want to say something sort of based off of what Tim was saying?
Yes, so I think the question was, if I can remember, like, how are we adapting in our fields? Something to that effect. And then Timothy,
a little bit adapting, holding your culture, but also representation.
yes. So I also wanted to popcorn off of Timothy. So he was talking about denial in his Indigenous ethnicity heritage earlier. And let me tell you, that was 110% growing up. It took me a while to internalize me being Indigenous. So I'm very nonchalant and just like laid back about talking about how I grew up. So I have a 6'9" Black dad from the east side of Detroit and a 6-foot Hidatsa mom off of the Fort Berthold Reservation. And even then I was like, I don't know if I'm Native or not. And my mom towering over me was like, hello, I'm right here. So it took me a while just to get used to that, because walking around, everyone was like, oh, she presents as Black. She's Black. She's Black again. So it took a good hard while for me to feel comfortable saying, I'm Hidatsa. I'm an enrolled member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. So putting that into my teaching, I always say, hi, I'm Mrs. Moss. I'm in a disguise right now. I don't traditionally look like what you might have seen in your curriculum or in your picture books or in whatever. We all look different. And I will put up pictures of my friends that will allow it, with big afros, with beautiful piercing blue eyes, from dark skinned to light fair skinned. And I have the added flavor of being Black. So I hit representation on two different sides. And that's where I like to take it. I adapt by telling them that it's okay to be comfortable in your skin, and it's okay to identify as being Indigenous. And me standing up here just being me is my representation and my resistance, and I always just like to go based off of that. So that's my adaptation into education as I'm teaching Native American and Indigenous studies. So.
Wonderful. Wow. Okay, well, DeAnna, do you want to respond to that?
Sure, I have, I'll try not to speak too much on it because I could really just talk forever about it. But I'm the same way as Kirsten, as Marique, as Tim, but I grew up knowing that I'm Indigenous, but having a white culture, acting as a white person. And I don't know if any of you had this. I would say it is an issue in school when they would tell you, we're going to do a project on talking about your ethnicity. Why don't you make a food that's cultural and bring it in? And we're a Native on my dad's side. And he had said, just tell them you're German. Through and through, you're just German. Now I was in Pennsylvania. So you have a lot of Dutch, you have a lot of German, and that was just the way that things were. And we always were a part of Indigenous culture, but it was so slight it was watching old John Wayne movies and my dad, you know, fantasizing over these stereotypes, but never really addressing the reality of what the issue is. And so now as a almost 30-year-old woman, I'm white passing in a Native community, but weird in a white community. Like people don't understand what's going on, what, you know, what's wrong with your face kind of thing. So I had met Madonna Thunderhawk last year, and I like sobbed into her arms and said, how do I move past this lateral oppression, because I'm not Native enough within my community. I'm not enrolled because I'm still on original territory. Those documents, that knowledge of my ancestors is gone. The furthest back that we can go is 1900, and that's it. So we are left with these oral traditions that aren't really enough at this point. You would think in 2020 that oral traditions would be important, especially because we rely on them for community or for ceremony and community as well. But they're still not enough for you to justify your existence. And so we're also left with these Native phenotypes, or what you should be looking like as an Indigenous person, but they're not ubiquitous. Not all of us are going to look the same. I can sit here and say, look at these cheekbones, and you would get what I'm talking about, but there are other Native people who don't carry the same physical characteristics as myself. But it would put me somehow on this level that I'm more Native than someone else just because of the way I look. Then you divulge the information that you're not enrolled, and then, you know, that that role of being Native is just taken from you because you're not enrolled. You're not part of this system that has dismantled your family. And so I use my representation to continue living on the East Coast. I refuse to move out west, and people will say, well, why won't you move out west? That's where all the opportunities are. And that's exactly why I won't move. I should not have to continue marginalizing myself to go to an area that we were forced to go to. Why not stay here and reclaim what is ours and continue teaching people about the Natives who are still very much here? And so that's my very long answer.
Yeah, I just want to chime in on that and say that, you know, blood quantum was not something that was inherent in tribal cultures.
Mm-hmm.
It was actually imposed by the US government in the context of the land, the Allotment Act and such. So it's really important as a decolonizing act to not sort of buy into those narratives. So I support that completely.
Okay, well, thank you for your question. And I know Kirsten had something she wanted to say, and then I want to sort of wrap up to our final question for everyone.
Okay, so that's utterly fascinating and interesting to hear from these different perspectives. My mother was where I got my Native line from. She was raised in a culture that was told, you don't tell anyone that you're American Indian. You will be treated differently if you're not considered white. And I think that that was very prevalent in her generation. My father, who is Polish and German, utterly embraced my Native heritage, and my brother. And he worked with my mother to convince her that this is what they should do. They should enroll us in the Muscogee tribe. And they did, and they were successful in doing so. And I've been a voting member since I was 18 years old. And that's been wonderful. And I'm so grateful that I can be a part of the votes and be involved in everything, even though I'm always absentee, even though I'm always distanced. That being said, my mother was a dancer, and she was also a pianist, and she was raised very much with this beautiful ideal of the dancer she wanted to be like was Maria Tallchief. And I find that very fascinating because she was told not to have that be a part of who she was, but yet she still found that representation for herself. Mm-hmm. And I didn't have anyone that I could say, I want to be like this singer, or this musician, but I did have Maria Tallchief, and I actually got to see her speak once, and I thought that was wonderful. But I wanted to just share a quote of hers that always resonated with me, and I looked this up while we were talking. Above all, I wanted to be appreciated as a prima ballerina who happened to be a Native American, never as someone who was an American Indian ballerina. And I have always felt that way. I've always wanted to be appreciated for who I am as an artist and showcase my heritage through what I do, as opposed to someone saying, because you're Native American, I want to hear you sing. That wasn't something I ever wanted to be. I wanted to be known and appreciated for who I am and what I can bring to the table, who happen to have this extra cultural layer, who could bring that and be interesting and maybe be something that you didn't see before. But it happened to be because I was already very good at my craft. And I think that because I was raised by parents who so deeply wanted me to appreciate my culture, that I've been able to do that quite a bit. And I've been embraced for who I am. And I think this also plays into being a woman in a field where, you know, we don't have a lot of women starting opera companies. And so I'm a minority woman starting an opera company with a friend, and it's something that isn't seen a lot. And because of that, we are starting our own representation. And I am always so humbled when someone tells me I'm some sort of inspiration to them or to their children. And I think that all of us probably fit into that on some level, that we've inspired someone. I think it's exciting. I think it's very liberating in some ways. And I love that maybe the representation people need to see is actually happening in something like this today. And I hope that we can all bring something to the table and be seen for who we are. And then that Native heritage becomes a part of that, as opposed to just being seen for what's on our face and the color of our skin.
Can I just add to that, that I wanted to be a Native American ballerina too, as a child. That my first big theatrical experience were working with Moscelin Larkin, who is half Russian and half Native American, one of the 5 Indian moon dancers. And to me, she just represented like the pinnacle of amazing international culture. And I was like, I've got to go to Russia and Europe because I met this amazing Indian dancer as a child. She was fearsome and fierce and amazing. And I just wanted to be around her all the time. So we all have a ballerina in our dreams somewhere.
He was serious. He meant that, a ballerina. Okay, so let's really wrap it up. And that was a great introduction, Kirsten, to really our final question about representing and rebirthing and modernizing your culture and how you guys are going to do that. I guess Gabriel's been silent for a little while, so we'll want to start off with our final question.
All right, sorry, unmute myself. Yeah, I was always told by my grandmother to listen more than you speak. She said it's a very important thing, because sometimes our tongue just flaps in the wind, so we have to be cautious of that. So to listen, I wish I could tell our politicians now to listen more than they speak. Just readdressing very, very briefly about cultural identity and who we are as a people. That is the whole definition almost of colonization right there. We've allowed ourselves as Indigenous people for somebody else to tell us who is not Indigenous that we are or we aren't. That is the saddest thing in our culture when we travel amongst Indian country, of who's how much and what's your blood quantum and what's your CDIB, and you don't have a CDIB card. My tribe, we're the last federally recognized tribe in the United States in 1975. And anybody born before that date, on their birth certificate, they checked other. No explanation, just an other. We were an other. But it wasn't until 75 that the government then realized that they need to keep tabs on us. They need to know how many of us that they need to fear. So until then, we were at war with the government. And then we all had to go back and we had to get tribal enrollment cards and whatnot. So again, for those that struggle with that, I tell people either you are or you aren't. If you're Native 1,000%. Forget what anybody else tells you. If it's in your blood, it's your blood, period. How to move forward. Again, there's so many battles out there. We really need to strategically pick which ones we want to face at the times, which ones that we feel that we can actually win and not just bring awareness to. I mean, I was part of Standing Rock. I lived there in Standing Rock for months. I used my platform. Again, we all have this platform in a mainstream world as Indigenous people. And we need to utilize that for, again, the betterment of all our people. So I lived there in Standing Rock. I slept in my truck for months. I sold some of my guitars to raise money. I gave away CDs. I got shot at by the government. I got maced by the government. I faced this head on. Again, I don't fear anything except our children and our elders and our women not being taken care of. That's my fear. That is my biggest fear, is that people aren't taking care of our relatives as much as we should. That's what I feel we're losing. We're losing that cultural identity just because we're classically trained musicians and we've traveled to Prague. I think that's so beautiful. Congratulations. I never knew that about Timothy. I'm so honored to know that we as Indigenous people have excelled and we've pushed ourselves further than anybody ever thought we could be. Because again, that helps to further break these stereotypes as who we are, not just feathers and fringe. You know, we choose to adorn ourselves in the way that we want to respect our culture, but it's not what we're attached to. Again, regardless if I wear earrings or a necklace or feathers, it doesn't take away the fact that I am an Indigenous male. So to move forward, I really feel we need to move backwards to move forward. We need to all get grounded. We need to have a rebirth of our cultural ways. So many tribes, unfortunately, have lost their languages, their ceremonial ways, our cultural practices. For me, I'm very fortunate that I was raised in this world. I was raised with ceremony. I was raised with songs and language. I do feel like a millionaire, even in these times of COVID, where as artisans, we're all technically unemployed, but our arts are essential. That was the hardest thing, I think, for me, is realizing that I'm not essential. And then I saw that through the arts, through music, I give concerts every Monday night, unless I'm away at ceremonies, on my Facebook page. Every Monday night, I give a concert for an hour and a half long for free. I don't charge, and I call it Concerts for Healing. And that's our way of giving back. That's why we started as musicians. We didn't think we were going to be rich. We should have been a lawyer instead, right? You know, a doctor, you know, but we knew that there was healing through music, and that's what drove us, healing through art, whether it be visual art or audio or whatever you want to even call art these days. That's why we did it. So again, that's what I continue to do, is to give back, to sing prayer songs amongst those people that are suffering. And we are the quintessential people, not just essential. We are the quintessential people because we are the ones that are getting people through this mental anguish that they're carrying, emotional, and through our spirituality, I feel that we will push forward. So I always tell people, I tell our youth, I tell my nieces, my nephews, know your culture first. Get that strong foundation, because when you once have it, then it will continue to push forward. And people always say, you know, our legacy, what's our legacy? For me, as a musician, I think it'd be great for somebody to say, you know what, in his passing, wow, he was a really great guitarist. But more important, he cared for our children. He fought for them no matter what the cost of his own life. That, for me, is more important than anything in this world. So again, I know this is my closing statement here. I approve this message here. Tell everybody to vote. Tell everybody to mask up, be safe, and ensure that we have hundreds of years of our cultural ways for children to come. So again, thank you so much to Sage, to Jackie, to all you relatives out there, Indigenous relatives. I say Chocotesia, thank you so much. And we'll see you at the front lines somewhere.
Right on.
Chocotesia.
Right on, Gabriel. Thank you. Marika, you want to go next? Just a closing about what you're doing about sort of preserving and moving forward, bringing yourself into the next sort of stage of.
And Gabriel reminded me of this, and youth is important. So if you wanted to remember to touch up about, you know, what you're doing now and what you're doing with youth or anything like that, he mentioned that.
Okay. So I'm graduating in December, and I'm trying to piece my life together with all of these uncertainties happening around me. I'm going to be an advocate and an activist till the day that I die, through and through. I'm going to preach till I'm blue in the face, especially Indigenous identity. Again, I'm just teaching right now, and it's not traditional teaching. It's actually kind of cool. So when you don't have, Minneapolis does this thing where instead of you getting like the turkey hand or like, this is what you do for Thanksgiving, they bring in Indigenous voice. And oddly enough, I have this specific degree in Native American and Indigenous studies and being an Indigenous person. So they go, hey, we don't really know what we're doing here, and Minneapolis is pretty intertribal. Would you like to do our Thanksgiving unit? And I'm like, I would be more than happy to do your Thanksgiving unit. So I'll come in and I'll do their units, and you know, we'll just go to the basic. What's a tribe? What's a federally recognized tribe? We'll do the state, we'll do the basics. And it's pretty fun. I do from like second grade to even undergraduate, and I like to be very optimistic when I teach. So like when I'm teaching Oklahoma to like high schoolers last year, I'd be like, so this is OG Indian country. I always like to like gauge my crowd. I'm like, so how many tribes do you think there are here in Oklahoma? And mind you, I introduced myself as Miss Moss from the 3 affiliated tribes. And they'll get things like three tribes to like maybe 11. But, you know, that's just how it works. That's just the education that has to happen or happened. So that's how I like to gauge and see where I'm at. And then I hit them with the facts. And I'm like, so you're on these traditional lands, you have this many tribes. And that's kind of how I go about teaching. And now that I have this cool degree in legal studies, I'm like, did you know about the Indian Reorganization Act? Did you know about the Dawes Act? Did you know about this and that? So it's a whole plethora of things I like to throw in now. So it's a sprinkling of federal Indian policy in all my teachings now. So, and all the other background, like social justice things that I'm working on now with the Minnesota Freedom Fund for social justice stuff, and working with Indigenous businesses here in Minneapolis. Over the couple of years, we had Tent City, which was homelessness from Indigenous populations here on Franklin, where AIM started. That was barely hit the news, but it was acknowledged. It actually started here again, and now it popped up as the Wall of Forgotten Natives was bulldozed over again. So I'm active in this project of how do I help them? How do I help them not get fined $78. So now they have these warrants against them. So we have these bail systems going on. It's a mess over here, but I'm all into it and I'm all involved. So that's what we're doing over here.
We are really glad you are too, because I know that, you know, just sort of like a full disclosure, I'm a course manager at OU, and Marique is one of my students. So that's the connection there, and I was just so glad that she could come. So just addressing, we had two of the panelists that had to leave. Ty had to leave for a class he had to teach, and Tim had to jump off for a rehearsal. So
Thaddeus, do you wanna take a final statement then?
Yeah, I just think keeping the voices going and listening to each other, like Gabe said, and support and keep it going. And I think little by little, it all matters. And I find in general, personal conversations are the ones that seem to be the most moving to move things forward. You know, not in big sort of proclamations or whatnot, but sort of one by one, you know, engaging with people's curiosity often really pays off. So let's pay it forward. I've got to jump off as well, but thank you all very much. It was a pleasure to see everyone.
thank you, Thaddeus. Thank you, Thaddeus.
See you soon. Cheers.
Stay safe.
Kirsten?
Okay, so yes, I think that one thing I've discovered as I've gotten older, I just turned 40, everyone. I'm not afraid to admit it. I turned 40 and I'm better at 40 than I ever was at 30 or 20 or anything else. I also have a baby and she makes my life better on a daily basis and also exhausts me on a daily basis. So one thing I've discovered through COVID, through getting older, through all of these things, is that I've become incredibly strong in my own creativity and in my own voice. And I just want whoever is watching this, regardless of if you are Indigenous or minority or woman or anything that might be something I am or not, your voice is important. And how you feel about things is important, even if it is not what everyone else around you is saying. You need to think about things, you need to listen to people, but you also need to have your own opinions, and you need to bring forth what is important to you through your creativity, through your actions, through whatever you can, so that you have your voice. And because of finding my own voice and being comfortable with it, I am more creative, I'm a better performer, I'm a better human. And I think that the more we can just embrace our own voice, the better we will get along with our colleagues, and the better we are going to be able to work as a collective human society. So I want to leave with that and also say thank you so much. It has been a pleasure speaking and hearing all of you today.
Thank you, Kirsten.
Thank you so much. And finally, DeAnna, do you want to just make a closing statement?
Oh, sure. So going off of what Gabriel said when he first started talking, so pandemics aren't new to our community. And so when COVID hit, I wasn't that scared about what would happen until things started happening. But the silver lining here is that our communities are so resilient, and through artwork and music and what everyone else is doing as far as artistically, I have never felt better. I have been thriving so well in my art, and I really think that's just because of the times and everything that we're going through. We use it as fuel so that we can help heal other people. And I think going forward, that's just going to project with everybody who's beating or making music or doing art in some way. We're all just going to thrive so much better post-COVID because we're using it as energy to revitalize our community and come together.
Well, we have had an amazing hour and a half, and it got extended, and some people had to go, and that's okay. But we'll wrap it up. Sage, do you want to say something, and then I'll close?
Well, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and our thanks and honor goes to these artists. All of their websites will be linked to pavaropera.org, and you can hear more from them. And we also want to offer a very special thanks and also specifically to Miss Barbara McAllister. She helped to get me in contact with some wonderful contacts. She's a Cherokee opera singer and educator from Tulsa University. And she sent us a special song. We'll be playing that a little bit later after we air this video. And this video will also be available on our social media. So that's about it. And thank you guys so much for being here.
Yeah, and I just want to say it's been a pleasure to be here live on Facebook, which I stay away from as much as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And yes, I did. I don't like Facebook personally, but I like the platform and the reach that it has. And I truly appreciate how all of you are working so diligently and in your lives to promote and sustain and preserve Indigenous culture. So Wado, to you all, stay well, and
Happy Indigenous Peoples Day.
happy Indigenous Peoples Day to everyone. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.